I'm purposely being provocative. I thought multi-factor authentication was supposed to solve all this. Isn't that supposed to solve authentication authorization?
I mean, there's a thing here, and you kind of said the right words, is authentication, proving who you are, and then authorization, right? And what's tricky is, more and more, authentication itself is getting pretty good. If you like care about it and you make the right investments, right? So pass keys on the consumer side, kind of web authentication, YubiKeys, hardware tokens more on the more enterprise side. And even like TLS 1.2, like the encryption layers are better than they were. The authentication tokens are more secure than they ever were. So authentication itself is becoming like both commoditized and relatively speaking solved-ish if you're willing to make certain investments. But that leads you to well, if you're an attacker, what do you do now? Like, I can't steal someone's password in an enterprise context like you could 10 years ago or 15 years ago.
You are listening to The Secure Developer, where we speak to industry leaders and experts about the past, present, and future of DevSecOps and AI security. We aim to help you bring developers and security together to build secure applications while moving fast and having fun. This podcast is brought to you by Snyk. Snyk's developer security platform helps developers build secure applications without slowing down. Snyk makes it easy to find and fix vulnerabilities in code, open source dependencies, containers, and infrastructure as code, all while providing actionable security insights and administration capabilities. To learn more, visit snyk.io/TSD.
Hello and welcome to another edition of The Secure Developer. I am your host, Danny Allen, and I am super excited to be here today with Paul Querna from ConductorOne. Now, Paul has been in the identity space for a long time, the security space. I think he has some background at Okta, but Paul, maybe you want to introduce yourself for the audience.
Sure. Thanks, Danny. Paul Querna, CTO at ConductorOne, one of the co-founders. And, I started out, I'll call in infrastructure development and things underneath the cloud and building cloud services, and then saw a lot of data breaches that were not awesome, saw a lot of security issues that were not awesome, and eventually founded a cybersecurity company in the zero trust space that was later acquired by Okta, and then started ConductorOne a couple years ago now as kind of my second at-bat at building a security company.
Would you recommend starting a company? This is your second one. I'm just curious what your recommendation is for the audience.
Not everyone should do it, but I think it's one of the best jobs in the world. Like if you're excited by it and if you have to gain energy from the ambiguity, the chaos, the learning, but I love it, and every day is different. You're always learning something new. And if that energizes you, think about it, explore what it would take.
Yeah, it's a lot of work, and I've never done it actually. Interestingly, I've been in similar role, but never a founder, and I know how much energy goes into that. What led you to identity? And I'm going to group identity and access management together. Yeah. I know authentication and authorization are different, but what led you to this industry? Were you always interested in it, or just fell into it?
I mean, I was always interested in, I think, security, just from I want to make secure products and software, I was always in infrastructure and kind of things underneath systems, and security is an element there, but it was never my job per se originally. But it was seeing these security incidents and it actually led to identity very quickly. It's I grew up in an era of firewalls. We're going to use source IP address as the mechanism of trust in a network. And, you're well, what if someone comes from the same, from your work, if you have an office and people log in, plug into an Ethernet port, should they have access to production now? Right? It was wild that was our threat model, that this physical world where if you plug into a port, you have access to production data, right? So that's where I started. My starting point was oh wow, these firewalls are wild, and we buy more of them and they don't work. And then everyone has VPNs now and you can log in from anywhere in the world. That whole network layer was just broken to me from a security perspective. And so that's kind of got me into, well, what's the better solution? It is identity, who you are, what device you have is the right way to build a testation to make authorization decisions versus the network-based authorization decision. So quickly, that kind of 2015 era, I started a company in that space, zero trust space, because that was the inspiration was these network firewalls are the wrong way. You need to attest to someone's identity to make authorization decisions. So I kind of got into identity via trying to solve security problems.
Yeah, and I very familiar with those issues. I remember back in the 90s, I used to do pen testing, and literally you go plug into the Banyan Vines network, and there was no authentication. You were already on the network. You had access to everything. I thought, I'm purposely being provocative, I thought multi-factor authentication was supposed to solve all this. Isn't that supposed to solve authentication authorization?
I mean, there's a thing here, and you kind of said the right words, is authentication, proving who you are, and then authorization, right? And what's tricky is, more and more, authentication itself is getting pretty good. If you like care about it and you make the right investments, right? So pass keys on the consumer side, kind of web authentication, YubiKeys, hardware tokens more on the more enterprise side. And even like TLS 1.2, like the encryption layers are better than they were. The authentication tokens are more secure than they ever were. So authentication itself is becoming like both commoditized and relatively speaking solved-ish if you're willing to make certain investments. But that leads you to well, if you're an attacker, what do you do now? Like, I can't steal someone's password in an enterprise context like you could 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So then you try to move to, well, I'm going to steal their session. I'm going to let them log in with their hardware MFA, and then I'm going to steal their Chrome session and go use some app on as if I was that person. And so that leads you very quickly to kind of authorization, which is, what are you allowed to do given your identity? And I think one of the underplayed things, if you look back to the original like zero trust movement and what people were trying to do there, one of the pillars was actually like least privilege. Like you should have the lowest privilege you need to do your job today and not more. And that, that kind of, I think is lost out generationally. Like we fix a lot of the authentication stuff, but the authorization stuff is still like you get hired, you get access to everything in the company on day one or, week one, you get access to all kinds of stuff. And the reality is most of the time your job isn't doing all those things, That standing privilege is also what attackers go after now. So, there's Verizon data breach report, all kinds of, industry evidence you can point to that says you really you steal someone's identity, basically. You log in as them. They look like an insider threat, which is a whole different, I think a lot of B2B SaaSes and kind of enterprise companies don't think about insider threat that much. It's more thought of the financial systems problem. Like, we don't want someone to, fraud us and steal some money. But that's changed a lot now. I think it'll continue to change in the next decade where insider threat is not just a model of someone trying to commit fraud and steal from the company. It's also how the attackers are going to appear to you more and more.
Yeah, one of the interesting things is if you track, for example, you mentioned the Verizon data breach investigations report, there may be fewer internal breaches, but they're far more damaging because of the authorization that the individual has within the organization. And that becomes even more true in the age of AI where everything's pooled into central repositories and they can get access to this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's wild to think about, you say that, we're using coding agents or agents that help you write emails. And you think about it in an enterprise, I log in to my IDP. I might have hundreds of internal applications, right? Everything from a Salesforce to a GitHub to my internal support portal to, your spelling correction app, everything in between, from highly sensitive apps to less sensitive apps. And when I log in with SSO, I have access to all those. And so if I'm writing an email, should my agent have access to all my data as me? You think about these personal productivity agents. It's scary. They shouldn't necessarily have access to all your data, right? The proverbial Coca-Cola secret recipe locked away in a deep vault of a database or something, right? I might need that for part of my job that I need an AI agent to help me with. But when I'm logged in, writing emails at 10 a.m. on a Monday morning, I probably don't need all that data. I probably need a subset of who I am. And I think this is one of the challenges of the AI space. We don't even have the terminology yet to describe sub-users or shards of my own identity, where an AI that lives for an hour or 5 minutes to help me draft an email, what should it have access to? At the same time, I don't want a productivity barrier, right? If I am writing an email about my secret Coca-Cola recipe, I may want it to cite data from that, right? And we don't even have the terminology to describe the ephemerality of that kind of authorization.
Before we get to AI, and let's talk about that ephemerality of authorization. Is it possible, is it practical to do just-in-time authorization for the majority of actions that an individual takes, like for what you would do on a daily basis?
I think like there's a like crawl, walk, run here. We think about like from a corporate security or production security perspective. I think, a decade ago, people said, hey, I'm going to at least build a role-based access control ecosystem in my company. And it's going to say, look, if you have this job code, or you work for this manager, or you have these certain attributes, we're going to provision access to all these things when you get hired, or if you work on a specific project. It's very like carte blanche, frankly, and tends to be more like birthright access.
Yep.
And, you could move to a more dynamic access control mechanism, which I think kind of like stage 2 of a company is like, oh, well, I don't need access to everything all the time. So you think about even a developer or a SRE DevOps, you don't actually need like God mode in AWS all the time. Like, let's be realistic. Most of the time, you're going to log in and look at a CloudWatch graph or maybe click a button during an incident. But like, that's few and far between, partly because on the, there's so much Terraform and infrastructure as code, and like a lot of the world's evolved around that. So, but in an incident, you might need to be able to press a button very quickly, right?
Yep.
So there's a thing here where we see people doing things like when you're on call, you get elevated privileges, but when you're not on call, you don't. Or if there's an incident, there's a super easy way to escalate privileges, and then they go away after the end of the incident. And that's kind of a dynamic access control, which I think, you think about access, the things you have access to in a lot of companies turns into like a up and to the right graph where like the things you have access to only grows. There's a guy I used to work with named Jay. He'd been in the company for like 10 years. He started in support, moved to be like an SRE DevOps for a while, later moved to be a full software engineer. He had access to everything over a decade because he worked in different teams, different projects. So his roles kept accumulating. So he had a upward and the right graph of privileges in the company. And like, I think the mental model for kind of a stage 2, maturity curve here is like, you need to move to more of a camel where like you have some baseline privileges. Everyone gets email, like email's an essential service for your business, but like privileged things are up and down. You have them for a use case and then they go away. And that kind of, leads you to, standing privilege is actually risk. If you talk about like you're talking to your CSO, the more things you have access to is like risk under a curve. And, from a CSO perspective, you want to minimize risk. So you think about what is least privilege actually getting you? It's lower standing risk. So if any given identity is compromising your business, they can do less, which I think gets to a little bit. You mentioned the Verizon data breach report. Is like some of these breaches are really impactful. It's like the crown jewels. It's everything. So I think that's like the mental model you start moving to is like, well, how do I move to more dynamic access control?
So are you expecting that AI would control that authorization? And if the answer to that is yes, because I don't know what you're going to say. If the answer to that is yes, are we ready for that model where AI is able to make that governance decision? Like culturally, are we ready? Technically, I presume we are, but culturally, are we ready for it?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's necessary. Maybe it's the first statement when you think about. You can use this email example, but like, I'm writing an email. If everyone remembers the old school, like Windows user access control pop-ups, like, do you want to let this thing access your thing? Like
the model dialogue, it drove me crazy.
The modal dialogue that prompted for permissions is like, I think we've proven that is a bad user experience, right? And will not.
Yes.
But I do think, an AI model that can evaluate, hey, you're writing an email. The to-line is only internal people. I'm going to allow access to internal Salesforce data because you're writing an email and you're trying to pull stats on, some customer or something, right? Like that kind of in context access management, I think is kind of inevitable. And so, and it's going to be driven by user experience as well, right? Like you can't have things that break the user experience where it takes, 2 weeks to approve an AI identity agent to have ephemeral access to a piece of data. So I think out of necessity from a user experience point of view and a speed of business point of view, you will have AI making AI decisions. Now, culturally, are we ready for that? Like, not at all. It's like going to be a major challenge, I think, in the next, couple of years. But I think the reality is that, it's kind of like you can use self-driving cars as an analogy, right? Like, they have, at this point, lower crash rates than human drivers. Mm-hmm. And I think for access control, you can pretty quickly show very similar outcomes where the AI doesn't really make mistakes, just like for the most part, autonomous drivers don't make the big mistakes. And if there's a case where they can't handle it, the flow is you eject out. You're like, hey, I need your help. And you think about the concept of access control, it's like 99.99% of the time we can understand the context of what's going on, understand should you have access to something, and make a very quick decision. And if we don't, we escape out. We're like, hey, we need the user's help, or we need your manager to approve, or whatever the kind of exception policy might be. So I think that's a good mental model of the trust building over time. But it's still going to be gradual, especially when you think about like the compliance side of this, the auditor side of this. I think you'll have a lot of like dual mode things where the AI makes recommendations, but you have to kind of wait for the auditors to catch up. Like, oh yeah, they're right all the time. But that's just like building trust.
Yeah, and where does the accountability lie in that? Because I can see kind of one of three things pushing this. You could push it through regulation, like PCI DSS pushed security standards into the payment card industry, right? You could have insurance regulation saying, if you want to get insurance, then you got to do this. Or you could have just experience pushing this.
Yeah.
Regardless of the model, where does the accountability lie? Is it whoever implemented the AI, or is it the algorithm?
And that's the other thing. And it is risky here. Like, authorization is generally what I would call like a binary decision. It's a true or false at the end of the day. Like, did you get the thing you wanted access to? Which is different than, summarizing an email. Like, did you forget a good period at the end of the sentence? It's like, that's a spectrum of outcomes. You can kind of grade them. So yes, there's a thing here where like the outcome is a yes, no. And then who takes responsibility for that yes, no? I think there are already more and more regulations in compliance side of this encouraging least privilege. And then I think that's going to drive, we need a least privilege compliance mechanism, but we need to do that in a way that doesn't drive all our users nuts. And that I think is going to be the driver, like, oh, well, look, we can prove this AI considered factual things and was policy driven, and maybe use some of the AI for orchestration and all those other things. But at the end of the day, for maybe your highest risk entitlements, they might be much more policy controlled versus maybe some other things that are a little more loosey goosey AI. So I think both it's like least privilege is the driver at the end of the day. And then it's, how to make a good user experience. And then it's like, I still think of a layer of, not all entitlements or grants in our kind of identity parlance are the same. They're just, there's some that are truly your crown jewels, and others that are really productivity enablers and insider risk mitigation enablers. And so I think along that spectrum, you also even have different choices of how much automation you have.
Yeah, I expect it will be a heavily policy influenced originally, but over time, obviously go probably more towards AI. And
that's just one of the interesting things. I think when we think about identity in a business, it's a multi-party concern, right? So this is one of the challenges that I think this industry has faced historically. You have everything from like, HR, people management, issues of job titles and job codes and roles and all those things. You have IT concerns around kind of like help desk and getting people access to things they need and productivity. You have, kind of engineering and security concerns of like minimizing access and who should have what, and also productivity, even from the engineering side. Like VP of engineering wants their team to be able to ship stuff, so you can't lock it down so hard you can't do anything. And I think one of the interesting thing about AI is you can actually encode more and more of those personas almost as different AI agents. You think about a business, whereas previously it was really hard because it was like, well, I could buy a IT-oriented access management solution, but it kind of ignored all the other people. And now I think with AI, you can start encoding those different peoples and personas and their concerns and their goals into independent agents that can all act on a request and work together to make a decision. You think about some of the AI agent like architectures. It's like you have a planning agent and then like sub agents. I think you'll see this where each of your sub agents are your different business concerns, and then you'll have an overarching architecture of making a decision.
Where do you see those agents living? Like, I can envision a world where they're inside the code of the software, the application. I can envision another world where they're operating over on the runtime, on the network side. Like, yeah. And the answer, of course, in the long term will be all of them talking to one another. But is there an easier or better place to start?
I mean, look, this is like those, it's predicting the future of like a nascent world. I think it is going to be a little bit all the above eventually. I think pragmatically, there's a lot of, you have to look at like where protocols exist, I think, to understand where decisions can be more easily injected, right? So, I think a lot about like the SSO layer. At that layer, it's pretty easy to inject, hey, let's do some extra work here and figure something out, right? Now, but when you think about row level access to a database, a Postgres database, there are products out there that can kind of like sit in the middle and read what you're doing, but like they become more invasive. And so I think you'll see it start in the easier places to implement. And then there will be some companies that build kind of, the proxy that has an AI in the middle making decisions. And I think those will work too, but they're just harder to adopt generally. So I think you'll see a spectrum of the deployment architectures and kind of like goals and outcomes.
In an AI world, like you prompt something and say, I want to know something, that particular AI thing that you're talking to, how does it delegate down your authorization into the massive set of data that it probably has access to in the vector databases or in the model itself?
Yeah.
How do you propagate that across agents?
Yeah. So this is an area I think of, there are actually like multiple draft RFCs driving this question because the idea, maybe just back up for a second for terminology. In my mind, there's kind of like a couple of different agent types in the world. There's kind of like company agents. You can almost think of them as another employee, and they'll have inputs and requests. And, do they take on my identity when I ask it a question, or does that agent inherently have its own roles and permissions and everything else? I think you'll see both answers there. I think there's also kind of like personal productivity agents, which are, again, helping me write an email, helping me write code. They're really like my agents, and they get a subset of what I want at any given time. And so I think if you split there and you say like, well, the subset question I think is a little easier, right? It's really an identity propagation question, an OAuth. We're going to have extra claims on the access tokens and the ID tokens that say, oh, this is an agent acting on my behalf. Treat it as if Paul was querying the database, right?
Yep.
And I think that'll be the pattern for personal productivity. I think for like more, you think about an agent almost like as a service account or an employee at a company, you'll see a mixture of both, where sometimes that agent is kind of impersonating me, and other times it has its own roles and permissions and things. And I think it will depend on use case, right? So like broad database access, I think you want more of an impersonation mechanism, especially if you think about you have like very like row oriented permissions. It will seem more like impersonation. But I think when you think of, where you want like a lot of summarization or other attributes, it's going to feel more like, well, that's more of almost a service account that you manage permissions to all the downstream data.
Well, I see this world getting super complex because I can imagine a customer calling up ConductorOne, say they want support, and there's probably general documentation that the LLM has access to all of it.
Yep.
Then there's probably a subset of support data that you want them to get access to, but it's not their cases. So it needs to be anonymized in some way because there's relevant information in there, but it's not their data. And then, of course, they might be asking about something specific related to a case that they opened 3 years ago, and you want them to have that specific. And so there's this weird dynamic of there's public, there's pseudo-public but anonymized, and then there's a delegated access. It gets complex.
It's going to be super complex, but I think it's also, the developer side of this and like the products you can build side of this is like exciting at the end of the day.
Yes.
Like that is, just even that idea that I can understand previous tickets, understand anonymized data, mesh in public reference documentation for the deep link to like, here's how you configure X, Y, or Z. Like, that's pretty cool.
Yes.
Like 2 years ago, I would have said that's wild. There's no way. So, as much as yes, there's hard work to be done. And I think you'll see this, like I said, like the OAuth side, extra claims, like some of this stuff is happening in, real time, like even, the model context protocol and how it works and the authentication authorization of it. It's changing, every month, and that'll slow down eventually. And then I think it'll get to the kind of the hard work of like, well, cool. MCP makes more sense now. I can understand how to impersonate a user using OAuth claims. Now what? Now I have to figure out how to anonymize my previous tickets, right? So I do think it's moving really fast. In fact, I would say it's moving faster than like standardization can keep up. Like it's not far off, It's not going to be a 5-year thing. I think even today you could get pretty far. But I think, you just got to figure out the core principles. Are you impersonating or am I a service account kind of? And then from there you can kind of build your architecture and figure out how to manage the authorization.
Yeah, I've seen some of the proposals on the or not the RFCs, anyway, the proposals to extend OAuth to MCP, and I am encouraged by what I see. Two questions, because I know we're running out of time here. What worries you the most? So you're in this world of autonomous identity management, and my next question, I'm going to end on optimistic, but what worries you the most in what you're seeing within the customer base in the market today?
Look, identity was already hard. So if you think about the explosion of SaaS and cloud and all these things, they already had like really hard problems. Like I work at a company. My company has several hundred SaaS apps. Each one of those apps may or may not have customer data or other sensitive data in it. Those SaaS apps might have local accounts and API keys and service accounts and non-SSO users and all kinds of other concerns. And that was already a hard problem statement. Like honestly, when we started ConductorOne, that was the problem statement. Like that's enough. Like there's enough complexity there to deal with it. I think the general like InfoSec world, even the developer world, does not understand the volume and the ephemerality change that's going to happen, right? Like it's 100x. Like, especially when you're talking about ephemeral agents that have limited scope for limited time periods, it is exactly like going from like physical machines that you bought from Dell to an AWS Lambda that existed for 8 seconds while it serviced like 4 requests. And the thing is that transition, that took, kind of the cloud world, 15 or 20 years to go from understanding physical servers to products that are optimized for, ephemerality, right? And this is going to happen in like a very, very small number of years. So I think that's the hardest part is like the complexity, the ephemerality, all the things about agents is going to make this identity world even harder. Mm-hmm. And I just don't think most businesses they're still catching up with the cloud growth. And this is also going to be very fast and it's not optional. That's the other thing is like if you talk to the leaders of companies, there is a board level mandate to use AI. And how aggressive is that mandate? It varies by industry and by board and different things, but like it is inevitable that every, successful business will be leveraging AI in many, many use cases. And so that means like the security side, it's like, it's happening. Like you have to deal with it. And I just think we're not like generally not prepared. Like it's going to happen really fast. We're not going to have the amount of time we had with cloud and the pain points are really big.
It's AI or die. I mean, you're not going to survive in this industry unless you're using AI in a meaningful way. What makes you most excited? So you're obviously on the cutting edge of this non-human identity and ephemeral, identity. What makes you most excited?
I mean, I think there's a real, actually, in our world, an opportunity to remove a lot of human toil. Like the things you had humans in the loop doing on access management were kind of ridiculous, right? Like I'm going to submit a ticket to IT help desk. IT help desk is going to go to look at a spreadsheet to look up who my manager is to find out, am I allowed to get like Office 365 or something ridiculous? Like that is 100% is solved at this point, even with just using AI. So I think there's a lot of automation that's coming and already being built. And I think part 2 of that is you're going to move to a world of the like exception handling is what humans do. And the everyday of it is going to be very automation, AI, policy driven. And that to me is really cool because that means like the humans, especially in like the identity world, we have kind of identity administrators and a whole cast of characters in this world. There's like projects you just couldn't do before because you were toiling down with all this day to day. Hey, we hired 50 people on Monday, like fix their stuff, or we're doing M&A, like our identity world just tripled and we don't know how to deal with it, right? Like these projects now become your focus instead of the toil of just everyday access management. And so that's where I think the world's going. And it's generally a positive thing.
Yeah. So if I'm reading you correctly, you don't believe that autonomous identity governance is going to displace IAM teams. It's simply going to empower them to do the things that they really should be and could be focused on.
I think overall, I mean, it's you could say the same thing about, software developers. Like,
yes.
Is Cursor and all these things like zeroing out the field Like, no. In fact,
Yeah.
I talk with my engineers about this. Like, your job is evolving. Like, your job now needs to involve more product vision, more understanding of what customers want. Like, the hardest thing is knowing what to build, not necessarily the act of coding it. It's getting faster and easier. And I think it's the same thing in kind of identity space. Is like, the important skills are what to build, why to build it, what creates business outcomes for your company, how to make your company materially more secure, how to reduce the standing risk of your company. That's what you need to focus on, not the toil of, help desk tickets and ServiceNow tickets, right? Like, it's just different goals. And so I think there are, similar to software developers, which I work with every day, this identity world's also evolving.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I tell that same story internally. Like, developers are not going away in any way, but we should embrace it. Like, we should use this technology. We can't ignore it. In fact, we should look at it as a superpower for us. Well, Paul, it was great to have you on the podcast with us on the Secure Developer. I love the perspective on autonomous identity governance. And for everyone who is watching this or listening, thank you for joining us again on another episode of the Secure Developer.
Thanks for tuning in to The Secure Developer, brought to you by Snyk. We hope this episode gave you new insights and strategies to help you champion security in your organization. If you like these conversations, please leave us a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and share the episode with fellow security leaders who might benefit from our discussions. We'd love to hear your recommendations for future guests, topics, or any feedback you might have to help us get better. Please contact us by connecting with us on LinkedIn under our Snyk account, or by emailing us at thesecuredev@snyk.io. That's it for now. I hope you join us for the next one.